All right, I welcome you to our first session in the public lecture series to Understanding Video Games. I'm Benjamin Hanusek, and I will lead you today through the first chapter, Studying Video Games. So let's have a look at what our agenda has on today. So we will go through 4 subjects within the chapter, which encompass who studies video games, how do you study video games, types of analysis, and schools of thought. Maybe one thing also to remind you of, this lecture series is done in a way that you don't need to have the book or even need to read the book. Chapters as the sections within this video will provide you with a comprehensive outline of the main aspects. However, to really understand what's going on, it makes sense to read each chapter either before or after this video. So I recommend you to get either the ebook version, the PDF version, or the physical version of the book that you can buy pretty much everywhere in the internet. Can order it or order it to your next bookstop. That I do highly recommend, as if you decide to have even only one book on video games, I'd say this might be the right book for you to choose. Okay, so let us begin with who studies video games. In general, they are professionals predominantly occupied with the study of video games. Undergraduates can now major in video games. PhD programs have emerged. Dedicated journals are available and distinct conferences are held. In the larger academic scale of things, all of this is still new. However, Espen Arseth, editor of the Game Studies Journal, noted that 2001 can be seen as the year one of computer game studies as an emerging, viable, international academic field. Obviously, game studies itself is an academic field, so the primary source and target of this kind of research are academics. Students, doctors, professors, researchers within research institutions and universities are the ones who generate the main corpus of game studies. Now, there are several takes on that. However, one of the most accepted versions of it is, as presented here, that 2001 can be seen as the starting point of the academic field of game studies. However, there have been already researchers before that. There are even proto-game studies publications in the 80s and 90s that try to analyze video games. Some people go even way farther into the past and start with researchers such as Johann Huizinga, who did in the 1930s the first comprehensive and full-fledged publication on the phenomenon in play and culture. So there are various takes. However, if we talk about the academic field of game studies, we can regard the late 90s or early 2000s as the kind of time when a lot of researchers, majorly from media studies, from literary studies, from film studies, start to take their methodologies and focus on the analysis of video games. Now, as said, academia remains the major part where game studies is practiced, researched, and read. What is not mentioned in this chapter is, however, that there are also other entities that do study video games, which is the industry and the press. The industry studies, of course, video games, but not by the academic means of practitioners in universities and research centers. The industry is, of course, researching video games. Developers are researching their own video games, how they perform, how popular they are, how well they sell, and how players perceive their games in order to optimize their product. The press is interested in providing investigative journalism, but also game reviews. So in a less academic sense, they provide also research methodologies that try to provide reads to video games in a different fashion, of course. All of these three stakeholders that study or research games have, however, different kinds of motivations. Academia, in most cases, especially in Europe, is a publicly funded institution that does research that mostly tries to provide an academic benefit. So it tries to do research that advances the academic take on video games. However, also the public good is always something that receives a lot of funding and research interest. So how can we provide research that improves our understanding and utilization of games in a public or social context? The industry has totally different motivations to conduct research, mostly in order to optimize their product, to sell more units, and to provide, besides just being a capitalist enterprise, to also provide better and more sustainable experiences for players. Hopefully, some do that, others don't. However, there we can see, nonetheless, the industry is a capitalist endeavor. We have companies that have to be sustainable, and in that sense, research that is done in the industry focuses not on knowledge itself, but rather on how knowledge can be used to forward their own agenda, which is selling more units and improve their product. The interest of press is, however, on one side, one could say, to provide content that is popular. So academia does not necessarily conduct research that is aiming primarily on being popularized, but the press does. So most articles that are written or that are approved by editors of major journals such as GameStar in Germany, IGN, or Kotaku and various other magazines focus on what is popular and what can be researched on. However, there we have also this investigative component. They have different motivations. Therefore, researchers, they study games also in a different fashion, though one could also consider reviewing games is also a form of games research by non-academic means. So this is who studies video games. However, the book focuses majorly on this academic sphere. The next question the book or this chapter asked is how do you study video games, or how do we study video games? Most researchers, at least at present, choose to adopt methods and approaches from their primary fields. Ethnographers tend to observe players. Those trained in film studies tend to analyze the games themselves, and communication scholars tend to analyze interactions between players. There is nothing inherently wrong with this tendency as long as one acknowledges the more general ideal that one should use the methodology best suited to answer the question at hand. So there is a plethora on ways how to study video games. It mostly depends really nowadays, especially as game studies is in a very, after around 20 years being an established field, rather young field of studies that still borrows a lot of methodologies from fields, from external fields such as media studies, communication studies, film studies, literary studies, but also psychology, sociology. So the theories and methodologies are externally brought in or imported and then used as a scope or a lens to research video games. But as it is stated at the very end of this quote, most important should be using the right methodology for the question at hand. So depending on what we are looking at or which kind of analysis we are trying to do, so depending on what interests us in the game, so whether the player experience or the gameplay experience in regards to the game design, so depending on the component or the entity that we try to closely look at, that should lead us in choosing the appropriate methodology. For example, if we're interested in what constitutes a game, what is the essence of a game, its rules or other entities, an ontological approach might be appropriate, philosophical approach, or other theories from different fields. However, if we're more interested in what it means to be satisfied as a player when engaging a video game, eventually psychological or phenomenological approaches might be more appropriate. So, there are many ways to study video games, but most important is it depends on the research question. So, depending on what we're trying to find out, we should look for appropriate methodologies that have already succeeded in answering similar research questions. And obviously, it depends on the researcher's background. If we have a background in psychology, it might make more sense to utilize this background rather than using a film studies background. However, of course, you can be a psychologist and still being interested in a film studies approach to a video game, but then it might be more appropriate to collaborate with an expert in film studies instead of just trying to mimic the approach. Also, our methodologies must be, in the best case scenario, be grounded on pre-existing research. It is not a good idea to start with research that has never been done like that before, which doesn't mean it shouldn't be innovative or progressive. However, the best research starts in looking around and trying to find similar approaches in order to see what worked, what didn't work, and then use methodologies from these approaches for your own research. These methodologies have to be also accepted by the research community, so we cannot use approaches that have been refuted or are refused. We can do that, of course, but then most likely our research won't be accepted or will be contested by our peers. So it is always important before starting video game research to have a clear question in mind and then already see whether there exists already research that has tried to answer similar questions and maybe look towards the more successful versions of that, and even at the less successful to kind of be aware of pitfalls in methodological approaches and be aware about which methodologies are outdated and which remain accepted. So this is how we study video games. Now, there are different types of analysis, and there might be more to it than on this slide. However, Egenfeldt-Nielsen, Smith, and Tosca, so the authors of Understanding Video Games, agree to 5 approaches that are based on that is based on work by Salin and Zimmerman. They have, however, extended these types of analysis by ontological and metric analysis. So they name 5 types of analysis that are established, that are around, and that make sense in game studies. And these are game analysis, player analysis, cultural analysis, ontological analysis, and metric or metrical. I don't know if the word exists, but let's just call it metric analysis. And in these forms of analysis, we focus whether we are looking at the game itself, at players, at the culture that provides the context for games and players, at the ontology, so the essence of the game, or are we looking at numbers? That could be performance of the game itself as software on a hardware device, but could also be the popularity of a game in numbers, or other forms of metrics that are provided that happens. Player-centered metrics could be psychological research that provides numbers to how satisfied players were with this approach, whether there was an impact on their understanding or on their emotional state, and these provide numbers. Common methodologies in these fields in game analysis is textual analysis. That would be trying to look at the game as a form of text and what this text tells us and how meaning is created within this form of text that games are. It might be a bit something difficult to wrap your head around, but this is the theoretical inspiration people get comes from comparative literature and film studies. So it is inspired by how games create meaning, and then looking at games, at various games, at various game genres, comparing them and trying to find an interpretation how these games provide meaning. Common interest is being stated here are design choices and, as I already said, meaning. So how do design choices in the game create a particular meaning? Just compare a horror game like Amnesia: The Dark Descent to playing an ego shooter like Call of Duty Modern Warfare. How is meaning created by the design choices that the developers did in each of these games? How can we analyze and interpret that? If we try to analyze players, common methodology is observation, interviews, and surveys. So we are interested in the player experience, phenomenological or from a psychological point of view. So we're interested in the opinions and emotions of players. So we're players are being observed, let's say in a play booth where they play. They provide insight by retrospective interviews and surveys and like that, and analyzing not just few but hundreds of surveys, we get an idea what a particular game means to these players or how these players perceive this form of experience. The inspirations for this kind of research we find in sociology and ethnography and cultural studies, where human experience is at the center, and not just human experience itself, but also groups of humans. So player research doesn't have to be focused on the individual, but could also refer to communities, as we see under the common interest column with the use of games and game communities. So how are these games used? Which kind of experience do they provide? If we have a cultural analysis, again, interviews might be important, but also textual analysis. So by using cultural studies and sociological approaches, we can interpret the game as a text and look at games as artifacts and try to find out how the cultural context of a game has left certain breadcrumbs in the design choices that tell us something about the culture. So we look at a game and at its narrative, at its representations, and get insight on the external culture and the people who created these video games and the players themselves. So as it says here, games as cultural objects, but also games as part of the media ecology. Ontological approaches do happen also, but are, I'd say, less accessible, as they are philosophically motivated in trying to find the essence of games. So ontology as a philosophical discipline tries or is interested at the essence of things themselves. So what is a game, and how is a game constituted? Not what does a game mean, but what is a game in its essence? And how can we claim universal principles that are always true? And for that we use several philosophical approaches, but also literary criticism and other forms of ways to formulate these universal principles, such as games are this and that can be seen in all games having this particular characteristic. And yeah, the common interests are logical and philosophical foundations of games, and again, like a strong approach towards finding the essence of a thing, right? So ontology, always remember the essence of things, looking for truth that can be reproduced. If we're having metrics or analyze games according to numbers, we have statistical analysis of log data. So let's say and developer is interested why a game didn't perform that well, then the developer will look at, for example, at numbers of sold units compared to other games, or basically in the game, how long did players play, when did they opt out, and try to find why did players stop playing the game after a certain time. But also looking at the performance, maybe there are bugs in the game that appear at a certain thing, and this is all within the log data. However, even psychological analysis, so experimental experiments that test players' perception or emotional state to certain games can give numerical data or just metrics. This is interested, software development and behavioral psychology provide many theoretical and methodological approaches for that. And the common interest is game design, because the overall question in why people look at metrics is in trying to find out why a game didn't perform well or how to improve the gaming experience. So as a recap, there are game-centered analyses, player-centered analysis, cultural-centered analysis, ontology-centered analysis, and metrics. Those are the different ways we can look at these games. We can also combine them. Most important is that we operate according to the research question that we have, and that we base our approach on accepted and solidly grounded research that is already out there. Maybe to clarify, it doesn't mean that we won't venture out eventually and establish new methodologies, but this takes its time. It takes time. So each research paper, each thesis, each project does something slightly different than other research projects and provide a little bit of innovation that in the scope of the time amounts to eventually a paradigm shift that happens when enough new research is out there to ground a new approach on that. So the last subject within this chapter are the various schools of thought that do exist in game studies, and they have been divided in two distinct different schools of thoughts. They're not limited to those, and many operating within these schools of thoughts wouldn't even consider themselves as such. But to simplify, one can speak of two established groups that ask research questions according to a certain pattern and approach these research questions with specific methodologies. And the first one are the formalists. Formalist group tends to use game analysis or ontological analysis. They represent the humanistic approach to media and focus on the works themselves or philosophical questions related to the nature or use of those works. Similar approaches are found in fields such as art or film studies. So formalists try to look at the medium itself, regardless of the context or the alleged intention of developers. Formalists try to look at a video game and try to find out what that video game means or what it is in its essence by looking of the elements it is constituted of. And these approaches are game-centered or ontologically centered and draw a lot on film studies or art studies, where we try to find out what a game is. That intersects with ontological approach, asking for the essence of things. Though these are still two different things, they interlap But ontology uses more philosophical approaches to ask for the essence of games, while game-centered approaches use fields such as art, film, or literary studies, where theories try to look at the game as a text and try to interpret the text and how meaning is created by that text and how it interacts. Another school of thought are the situationists. The situationists as a group is generally interested in the analysis of game players or the culture at large. They are not interested in all-encompassing statements that do not take context and variation into account. They search less for general patterns or laws and more for analysis and descriptions of specific events or social practices. So this stands in more or less stark opposition to the formalists. So situationists, they don't just look at the game, but at the overall context of the game. This could be the culture or the player that interacts with the game and creates a new context within the game. Playing a game, let's say when you're riding the bus or the train, might be a different context than playing the game in your own room. Playing a game together with other people is also another context than playing the game alone. And depending on from which cultural background you are from, you can perceive a game differently. Whether you're from Japan or from South Africa might have a different impact on how you experience that game and how you appreciate or dislike certain design choices that are within the game. So here, it is not really about looking at a game and trying to form universal principles that are true for all games, but rather looking at a specific case in a specific context and analyzing that context and what that context means for the game or the entities that are part of this context. So schools of thought, so we have the formalists focusing on the game itself. There we have also the narratology and ludology debate. Some of you might have heard that already, but that might be something to look at another chapter where we will be focusing more on the question of what a game is. And they approach games with an ontological and a game-centered approach. Situationists, they focus on the game within a context and have these cultural and player-centered approaches, so taking the wider scope of things into account. However, one thing that I'd like to add here as well, not mentioned in the chapter, but becomes more important as we also start to realize that, and we need to realize in academia that research is obviously also happening outside, which is funded by the developers and by the industry themselves. However, there we have this very strong capitalist incentive to find out or to create more capital by our game. We have this product-centered approach. We're trying to optimize our product to provide a sustainable business for ourselves and for consumers and players, and there we focus on numbers and the optimization, so metrics are way more interesting for the industry in that regard. So this was, in the most shortest way, everything that happens in the chapter. I still recommend you to read it and look at the examples that are provided over there for you to check whether you are whether you understood everything in that chapter. Ask yourself, who studies video games? Can you answer that? Can you answer how do we study video games? Do you remember the methodologies and when we should use certain kinds of methodologies? Which types of analysis do exist? And which kind of schools of thought dominate the discourse within game studies or video game research in general? The book provides at the end of the chapter and at the end of every chapter a number of discussion questions I find very interesting and that you should have a look at, that might help you to solidify what you have learned in the chapter. And here we have 3 questions. First one is being, there is a move away from linear media, for example, television, and toward interactive media, so video games and the internet. What causes this trend? Is it simply that technology offers new forms of interaction with media, or is the move tied to a larger societal change? This is, of course, a huge question. Again, depending on what specific question within this theme you want to answer, you might look at different methodologies. But what is definitely interesting in the scope of this question is to regard how games have started to influence many aspects of our lives. For example, the gamification of numerous smartphone apps or even the classroom, but also what makes interactive media more popular these days. There are many answers to it, but for sure something that I always like to think about is that interactive media provides way more metrics than non-interactive media. Authors of a book or directors of a video or a movie or a series get less data on how their viewers perceive that medium. Of course, they can look at reviews and other forms of feedback to that, but yeah, our interaction with these forms of media provide less immediate data to our usage, while interactive media is always, most of these types of media, especially today's, if not everything that is interactive and can be found on an online store, directly logs in data that is sent to a server. So that helps developers to optimize their product and make them even more influential or more provide more compelling experiences for users, which could in the long term just move more people into these forms of experiences, maybe because they're more satisfying for users, because they allow for more optimization by having logged data. Another question is, what are the challenges and pitfalls of opening up a new field of academic study like video game studies? What considerations should one be aware of when entering territory where very little previous research exists? We talked about this. It is very problematic to embark on a research journey if you have no research at hand. So it's always good to look around you and see what research exists. This, however, of course, slows the progress and innovation in the field, as we always rely on or retroactively on what worked. So this might be a pitfall. However, on the other end, I mean, now after 20 years of game studies, there is a lot of research out there. However, especially at the beginning, it was very difficult because there was a lot of research going on. But honestly, from today's perspective, a lot of research that didn't stand the test of time, let's call it like that, simply because they had no research they could base their research on. So this is a problematic aspect, though I can say with confidence that today in game studies we have a lot of research, resources and research that we can use to ground our projects. Last question is, how should students of games whose research focuses on one type of analysis deal with the existence of other type of analysis? Is it necessary in every case to address all the major perspectives on a video game phenomenon? How important is it to play games as a researcher? To the first question, it is very important to look beyond and not just be aware of your own kind of research. It is nowadays a lot of research is, or in my perspective, proper research is always an interdisciplinary endeavor. So you always collaborate with different scholars from different fields to arrive to a more holistic perspective of things. I think research that is being done with very narrow-minded point of view is problematic, and not sustainable. So it is always important to see what is around. However, good research at the same time focuses on very precise, articulated problems and keeps the scope manageable for the researcher or researchers that work on that problem. So it is always, so one cannot always have too many methodologies included, otherwise we get what is called commonly known as analysis paralysis, to having too much data generated that doesn't allow us to draw any conclusion at all. So it is good to be interdisciplinary, however there should be a limit to it, and we should always try to focus on the scale of things and the scope of things. What is doable and how can we arrive at results as efficient as possible? How important is it to play games as a researcher? It is as important as being aware of the literature. If you have no access to the medium itself, you are basically just reading about things you have no knowledge or direct personal knowledge about. This doesn't mean that we should get overly emotionally invested and write papers with that emotional attachment. Research needs to there is no objectivity, if you ask me, but we need to strive towards a certain degree of objectivity in order to make our research sustainable and understandable for other researchers to reuse our conclusions and our methodologies. So we need to know what's going on in the games. We need to know how games feel, especially if we are approaching them practically. But we cannot be at the same time too emotionally invested and too invested in our own personal experience of these games. So we need to always negotiate between our own experience and a certain academic standard that we need to maintain to allow the research community to reuse our research. So there are also further readings. Those I can highly recommend. Arsid's first article, but I also recommend his first publication, so Cybertext, but also a paper by Clubbers on the architecture of game science. Haven't read that yet, didn't come to that, but I will do that as soon as possible, I hope. And I recommend you to go over that. What I very much like about that is that they added an estimated reading time. Pretty much what press and games journalism is, or media in general, is doing anyway when they provide an article on the web. So, did you get what these sections are about? Can you engage in the discussion questions? And you might even want to engage further with these further readings. However, I also highly recommend reading the chapter yourself. And yeah, I hope this gave you an outline and understanding what the first chapter of Understanding Video Games is about. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see each other for the next session, which will be then on the video game industry. Thanks for viewing. Bye-bye.